American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center. We're very pleased you're here with us for this event today. It is part of a broader series that the Center for Latin American Studies is organizing this semester and next, commemorating Mexico's War of Independence and the Mexican Revolution. And we're very pleased to have with us today Lorenzo Meyer, who is one of Mexico's foremost historians and a professor at the Colegio de México in Mexico City. He's also one of Mexico's most important public intellectuals on a range of issues of contemporary Mexico, as well as the historical roots of much of what's taken place. So we will, Professor Meyer will give a presentation, and then we will have time for questions and discussion after the presentation. I'm also very honored that we have with us another Berkeley professor, Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, who is teaching here this semester a course on the promise and legacy of the Mexican Revolution. We're very pleased that Ingeniero Cárdenas is with us this semester here in Berkeley. So with this very brief introduction, I'd like to turn it over to a friend and colleague, Lorenzo Meyer.
Thank you very much. This is not the first time that I am here at this particular place, but it was long ago, that 5 or 6 years ago that I was here. So I am really delighted to be back at this university. And thank you, all of you, for coming, and especially the Latin American Center for the invitation. And when I was coming here, I was asked, what about this Centennial and Bicentennial? And I said that we are here to commemorate, but not to celebrate, because there are very few things to celebrate in Mexico right now. To commemorate, a lot. To remember, many things. But celebrations, although the government wants to celebrate, well, let them celebrate what they think it's appropriate, but I don't think that many Mexicans are willing to celebrate anything. So, to look at the Centennial and Bicentennial. I have a few general things to say, and let's start. What's happening with this? Hold on. Move it. Now, it just disappeared.
It will introduce more imagination.
Yeah. I'm not going to use much of PowerPoint things, but just see, it's not me.
No, it's not. There we go.
Well, manual if you want.
No,
now.
I'll set.
Ready?
The right side, yes.
Okay. Let's focus on the historical elements. What I think is important, it's let's focus first on the independence business. Looking at the historiography of colonial Mexico and what to make of colonial Mexico today, my feeling is that we were really a perfect colony, and we are becoming a failed state. We were perfect when we were a colony, because this 3 centuries experience of Spanish domination in Mexico has some elements that are really peculiar. Mexico was probably the most productive colony of His Majesty in America, and at the same time it was, unlike Peru, that was the other big, huge political, demographic, economic structure that these two, Mexico and Peru, were the big producers of silver, and similar in many things, except in one thing. Peru experienced internal rejection and bitter revolt against the Spaniards, and in these 3 centuries of colonial authority in Mexico, there was nothing like that. It was a very peaceful, to a certain extent, system of domination, lots of revolts, rebellions, local rebellions for local reasons, but there was not a single instance in which you could have the whole colonial structure trying to unsettle the political arrangement. So we were perfect in 2 senses. That never, there was not a challenge, a general challenge to the authority of the king, and it was a very productive colony, especially in the 18th century. Mexico was providing not only for its own administration, but it provided for the Philippines, the Floridas, Cuba, Central America, and of course for Spain and the wars that Spain wanted to wage in Europe. So it was extremely productive, and the arrangement was harmonious one from the point of view of Madrid and the king. So it was the external factor, as we know, it was the key element to explain why this independence movement began. There were, of course, bits and pieces of uneasiness, and the very small group of criollos were willing to discuss the possibility of changing the relationship with Spain. But by and large, the society, the Mexican society, Indians, mestizos, criollos, and peninsulares, were more or less accepting everything in spite of Bourbonic reforms that introduced a lot of noises and problems, but nothing like a general upheaval that took place in 1810. So it was the issue of lacking the king, the introduction of external factors by the international environment that produced the necessary elements for the beginning of this transformation. The external factor was crucial. Then something that was also very unsettling. It was immediate after the beginning of the independence, a racial war, a class war, something that make the Mexican affair different from the other wars and movements of independence in the rest of Latin America. Here it was an instant clash between Spaniards and criollos, and the Indians and the mestizos. Very few criollos decided to go with independence. But the nature of this clash, the racial and class struggle, produced, among other things, that the minority, the Mexican elites, criollos, Spaniards, and those mestizos that were part of the elite, had a very negative attitude towards the lower classes. The lower classes were dangerous by definition. What to do with them? So this is the first, I think, from the perspective that I want to present here, it's the key element. The lack of trust, of confidence between the elite and the masses. Just look at the situation in the United States. How different it was. These plantation owners that were at the same time the leaders of the U.S. independence, and the masses they led, there was a kind of trust. The aristocracy of the Eastern Coast was followed willingly by the majority of the Americans that wanted to be part of the War of Independence. In the Mexican case, in spite of the fact that Hidalgo was a criollo, John Tutino thesis and very well done explanation of the independence is that the Indians in El Bajío, that was changing very rapidly for economic reasons, thought for a while, for a very brief time, that in fact Hidalgo and Allende and Aldama and the rest of the criollos were representing their class. But they were not. So the Indians, the uprising was not because they thought that they themselves, the Indians, were going to be able to defeat the government, the viceroy and the king, but that the elite was divided. And that part of the elite was going to be with them. That was a very natural view from the lower classes at that moment in 1810, but it was a mistake, and the elite, the criollos and the Spaniards, were united against this upheaval of the masses. And the distrust of the masses, that's my feeling, remains until this very day in Mexico. You cannot explain the Mexican government of today, especially the panistas, without taking into consideration this cleavage between the middle classes, the upper middle classes in Mexico, and the rest. That's why during the 2006 electoral campaign, the idea of the left being a danger to Mexico, the dangerous classes led by a dangerous person could lead to a dangerous situation. Well, we are in danger, but for very different reasons. But this is one of the legacies of the independence. The fact that unlike Bolivar in Colombia, unlike San Martin in Argentina, or O'Higgins in Chile, here in Mexico, from the very, very, very beginning, the first day, the issue was a class war and a racial confrontation. And it was very brutal from the very beginning. The Alhóndiga de Granaditas massacre of the Spaniards was taken as a lesson for all of them, and they behaved accordingly. It was a confrontation in which you could not have mercy for the enemy. The killings, the killing of prisoners was a systematic one. Was natural. You kill the prisoners, and you kill everybody that you suspected. It's like Guatemala in the 1980s, 1990s. The same sense of urgency that if a community could be suspect of having sympathies with the insurgentes, you obliterate the community. You better judge everybody guilty, and don't worry about the innocent. They will be in heaven and will have the reward over there. But in political terms, it was a necessity because, after all, it's a very peculiar situation. The demography of the Mexican colony, in spite of this demographic catastrophe of the 16th century, was still very much a sea of Indians and a small minority of Spaniards, with these criollos and mestizos in the middle. So you have to be very effective in crushing the revolt. And as a matter of fact, they were. The independence effort was completely destroyed after a few years. If the independence came, after all, it was because the conservative elements in the colony decided that they were not going to have the liberals in Spain. They were not willing to pay the high price they had paid in Mexico to have the liberals now giving orders and unsettling things. So it was an independence against the willingness of the elite. It was the external world that forced Mexico to enter into this path. It was very different from what happened in the US and in other parts of America. So the legacy of independence, it's this failed nation. And I was reading, that's why I wrote Chris Fraser Dixit, this new book, Bandit Nation, that came in 2006. It's an interesting one. The thesis of Fraser is that the national character of Mexico was, to a certain extent, created by the idea of bandits, because there was no state. The elite couldn't provide examples, like here in the US, Washington will be the example. In Mexico, who is going to be the example? Who is the key figure that you can project everything positive? And Fraser says, probably the bandits are the best image, because they came from the lower classes, they were daring, they confronted the corrupt structure of authority, and were very willing to fight. And they were very brutal also. So Mexico failed as a nation from the moment we entered the independence state to the 1880s. I think this is the moment in which the liberal faction, under the leadership of Juarez and Porfirio Diaz, were able to create a liberal dictatorship and a liberal state that was able to function. For the first time, the central authority was more or less in charge of everything, politically speaking, and introducing a new way of looking at modernization, the economy, the culture. They create the army, a real army, well, real, no, not very real, but an army, and they introduce law and order more than law. But they introduce order. And the foreigners came and reshaped the external image of Mexico. Instead of the bandit nation, the very well paid book writers of British and American origin were very willing to give books, write articles, and produce newspaper pieces exalting the nature of the political system, and especially Porfirio Diaz. He was viewed in a very positive light. So we got, here it is. I have to use this. We got finally independence, but within limits. That's my main thesis in regard to independence. Mexico could not be a real independent country if it's close to the United States. It's an impossibility. It will remain an impossible situation, an impossible dream, really, to be able to have a real sovereignty. Diaz, after the war with the United States, after the French intervention, and after a lot of noises made by the US in the 1870s, 1880s, with the creation of a central authority, the US found unnecessary to mix with internal politics of Mexico and to make hostile noises. Everything became more or less negotiable, acceptable, and investment from Europe, investment from the US, and Diaz was thinking on investment from Japan. Didn't have the time, but he wanted to have this kind of rainbow of foreign influences in Mexico to equilibrate each other. So at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, we got what we still have. Independence, but
Point at the left to change it.
Here? Well, oh.
No, Dio, he's just using the laser pointer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, independence within limits. This is the basic idea in regard to independence. It cost a lot. It really imposed upon Mexican society and Mexican political elite a huge effort, a gigantic effort. And the result has been modest at best. Now, let's go. Well, revolution. Revolution, I see revolution for this purpose as a reaction to the original authoritarian system. It was a reaction to the failure of the Porfirian political system. It failed not because it was unjust or because it exploited the masses, it exploited the poor peasants. The masses and the poor peasants are still there and being exploited. That was not a variable, that was a constant factor. What failed, it was not the injustice of the system or things like that. It was the impossibility of that authoritarian system to adapt itself to modern times, especially because it could not solve the problem of transference of power. It was an impossibility. Diaz was so entrenched, he was so good at controlling Mexican politics that had no substitute. Never there to think of somebody to substitute him. And when time came, when age became a problem, he didn't have anybody to be up to the difficult task of controlling that nation that for a long time had been a failure. And the elements of failure were there. You could smell those elements. And Diaz was very good at smelling the troubles, the enemies. he was looking at the telegrams of Diaz to the governors. He had his own computer. He was very good at knowing who was who and who was doing what to whom. And the archives of Diaz is a treasure for this. For example, in regard to the Coahuila, the border state, he said to the governor, beware of Carranza. Carranza is going to give us trouble. He could be a revolutionary. He knew that. Without an intelligence system, without CISEN or anything that we have today, he knew who was playing what role at local politics. But because it was so personalized, so entrenched in Diaz's office, the system could not move easily from that person to another and another and another. They needed the PRI to do that. So the fracture of the elite was to a certain extent something that was going to happen. Nobody knew exactly when. But the electoral elections without meaning, but you have to have elections even if they didn't have a meaning. And that was the key moment in which Madero began what was only an effort to modernize the political structure, not to create a revolution, not to really involve the dangerous classes. But at the end, he asked, exactly like Hidalgo, he went to the masses and asked for their support. And at the beginning, they didn't. When he asked for the beginning of the revolution on the 20th of November at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, very few there to be on time. But little by little, they came. They came, especially in the north, especially in the border with the United States, because weapons were available, are available, will be available. From this side of the border. That's a constant also. And then we have the beginning of something that nobody wanted except the Liberal Party of the Flores Magón and very few real professional revolutionaries, because we have our professional revolutionaries before the Communist Party. But they were very few. Very willing, very daring, but very few. So the social revolution came with nobody in charge, really. Everybody was taken aback by what happened, and at the end, what we have is the modernization of authoritarianism. The PRI. It really introduces stability. Stability, that's the key element. That's what the elite wanted since the beginning of the 19th century. Stability was the aim of those who created the first stages of independence, Iturbide and the rest. What they wanted was to reintroduce stability. Juarez and Diaz were able to do that. Then, because of the failure of the original authoritarian liberal state, the revolution took place. And again, stability was the key element. So Mexican stability began really in the 1930s. It was Cárdenas, General Cárdenas' ability to introduce a new kind of stability. Juárez and Díaz, the liberal stability was the main element was control, political control. The use of the army, the use of the rurales de la Federación that were very good at their job. And the new stability was provided by Calles, first with the creation of the Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, the grandfather of PRI, and then by General Cárdenas with the introduction of huge historical reforms. Land reform was basically the instrument to introduce an element of social justice, not just control by per se, but control with something else. The agrarian reform and the support of the labor movement. Labor unions were created before Cárdenas, of course, but he gave them the support of the government, and with these two huge institutions, CNC, la Confederación Nacional Campesina, and the CTM, I think that, and the control of the army, new army, the new federal army, these three things plus the party, well, these four things now, the party, the army, agrarian reform, the labor organizations, it's a new stability. Mexico was able to live a stable political life better than the rest of Latin America. In fact, my proposition is that Mexico created the best authoritarian political system, not only in Latin America, probably in the world. Because if this system became stable in, let's say, the beginning of the 1920s, but we still have to deal with the Cristero War and things like that, and rebellious generals that were defeated, but were rebellious. So since the 1920s to this day, Mexico has remained politically stable. You cannot say that of Europe, for example, except England. You cannot say that of France, Italy, Germany, Eastern Europe even less, China, India. This is, well, in Latin America, you don't have anything that looks like this. So the legacy of the revolution, if the legacy of independence is relative independence, or independence within limits, I recall one book on Carlos Salinas, that's the title, Democracy Within Limits. So we have independence within limits. And then stability. But an stability that was not democratic, and that had an element of social justice just for a time. The 1930s. Cárdenas government. That was the one and only moment in which the left was in charge of Mexico, and introduced a lot of changes in a very few years. The time lapse is really reduced. The amount of change is really huge. And you have to take into consideration also the cultural change. That was really important. The feeling that Mexico was going to be poor, that's for sure, but it was going to be proud and fulfill the legacy of those defeated during the independence war, especially Morelos. that the sentimientos de la nación, what the nation wanted was basically, as Morelos said, to reduce the gap between the few that had lots of things and the many that had very few things. Well, for a while, I think, even in the 1950s, 1960s, in the 1960s, when Almond and Verba went to Mexico to do some research on public opinion because they needed, I think that they needed cheap airplane tickets, because they were really thinking on comparing the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy on public opinion. But they need some something different. There were 100 countries to choose to make a comparison. Underdeveloped country, and Mexico was there. It was so close, so cheap to go there, and they introduced Mexico in a very good survey, public opinion survey, perhaps the first good understanding of what was the public opinion in Mexico. And Mexicans, they found that Mexicans were very proud of their system. They knew that it wasn't democratic, of course, that it was ridden by corruption. Nobody was pretending to be that things were different. But they were proud of the Mexican Revolution, they were proud of the aims of the Mexican Revolution and the gains, in spite of the fact that they knew that Mexican democracy was a fake, was a failure. But other things were, for the first time, going well. Economic development, industrialization, sense of independence. 1960s, 1970s, probably. That's it. The dream began to unravel after the 1970s. So, contemporary Mexico. The two things that we have to focus is independence and social revolution. These are the two things that we are commemorating, as I said, not celebrating this year. And what we have really in regard to independence, we don't know. We honestly don't know what is going to be the immediate future of US-Mexican relations, because that's the key. The rest of the world doesn't exist. From the Mexican standpoint, the world is very small. It's just up north, and that's it. And not all the north, because you can discount Canada very easily. So it's the US-Mexican relations. Trade is concentrated there, as only during the Second World War was something similar. But that was supposed to be an exceptional moment, because it was a war, and Mexico had only one single external market between 1939, 1940 to 1945. But there is no war now, and we have the same concentration of trade, investment, and well, many other things. We are also a nation of immigrants. 11% of the Mexican population is living here. Where do you have something similar? And our main security problem now, narco traffic, is linked to the US, basically. So the key elements in our relationship with the outside world are located in the US. If we have relationship with other nations, we have a relationship with Cuba. It's one way of having the bilateral relation with the United States. Our relationship with Europe, it's an effort to have something to neutralize the United States. But Europe itself, it's irrelevant. Multilateral organizations, what are we doing in the United Nations, in the Organization of American States, everywhere? It's one indirect way of our relationship with the United States. There is no other bilateral relationship for us really significant, independent, with meaning of its own. Dependency theories and the concept of dependency was unfashionable for a while. But I think it was a good concept. And I think it's still very useful. My view is that we still have to use that concept if we want to explain our relationship with the outside world. Last week or last 10 days, something really insignificant, but at the same time very meaningful. The Mexican government decided that if somebody from the external world have a US visa, could go to Mexico. A US visa and going to Mexico, that means that our Minister of the Interior, what's the meaning of a Mexican passport? If it's the US government who is going to certify that other foreigners are good guys, so why don't close the foreign office in Mexico? Don't give passports. Apply for the US passport and you can go to your own country, again, being certified. I still don't get what, I know that in common sense, if Mexico need tourism, and it's very complex to create your own security network, and you need the US to approve really what people are coming, well, this is the way, is to accept the US visa as a Mexican document. I still wonder why not, like in Canada, if you go to Canada, you go through customs, US customs in Canada. That was really a surprise for me, but, well, Canadians are so sure of themselves that, what the hell? Give a small space to the US in the airport in Canada, and that they are the authority there. Well, as somebody said, the Canadians, well, they did have a war with the US, but they won. And we lost, so that's the difference. And what is what is the meaning of Mexican Revolution now? The persistence of social cleavages are just, I can have an array of statistics, but I have only a few ones, but very meaningful, very meaningful. This is the Gini Index of Inequality with the members of the organization. It's not in English, these things. It's Organización para, it's the Economic, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's it. Well, here it's from Denmark. My God, these guys are really interesting. To Mexico. I don't know why we are members of the OCDE. Because Salinas wanted, because he wanted, and Clinton said, yes, it's okay, Mexico has to be part of this small and prestigious club of what? Of rich states? Well, Mexico and Turkey are not. But we went there. And it's very interesting to be there because the statistics are available. And we are always the awkward case. Always, in any event, education and everything, Mexico comes out, my God, what these guys are doing here? Well, I asked the same thing to myself, but asked Salinas and Clinton, because both were willing to put us here. But look at the inequality index, my God. Then the social revolution, the Mexican Revolution, what happened to the Mexican Revolution? It gave us stability, not social justice, nothing else but stability. This is another way of looking at it. We look very much like the rest of Latin America, and the other countries of Latin America didn't have a Mexican Revolution or something like that. So it's just an hypothesis or an idea. The Mexican Revolution is meaningless in regard to the substantive issues, because we are exactly like the rest of Latin America, and the other Latin American countries didn't have a revolution 100 years ago. So at the end of 100 years, we reach the same situation. We are in the same position. So why? What was the purpose of the Mexican Revolution? The key idea was to transform Mexico, to make Mexico a more just society, a more humane environment, from a former colony that was a success as a colony, but that colony was based on the idea of exploitation. And the U.S. was a colony of poblamiento. I don't know how to introduce people to this part of the world, although there were other people here. But Mexico was not a population colony. Very few Spaniards went to Mexico. Very, very few, just a tiny fraction. At the moment of independence, we had only 20,000 Spaniards. That means there were no Spaniards in Mexico. But the wealth of Mexico was going where Spain wanted. So the inheritance of the colonial times is still here. We have not changed the real nature of Mexican society. Independence is meaningless in regard to the transformation of the social cleavages. And not only in Mexico, it's in Latin America. We still have that kind of social structure. And I think that I don't have any. Well, yes. Yes. This is my favorite. This is the last. Confidence rating. My assistant took the source, but it's a good source. Believe me, it's a good one. He just cut. It's what's the name of the company that? No, Latinobarometro. No, probably you are right. It's Latinobarometro, but I took it from Mitofsky. Mitofsky, the latest of Mitofsky. And this is just a beauty. Well, if you don't want to cry, it's a beauty. The most trusted institution in Mexico are the colonial institutions. The church, the universities, and the army. The king is missing. It's the only thing that is missing there. But it's the authoritarian institutions, because the church, of course, that is authoritarian. The army is authoritarian. And the universities, I don't know about Berkeley, but in my country, they are pretty authoritarian, because it's their nature. Somebody is going to be teaching and somebody is going to be taught. What is really interesting is that Mexicans trust the media. I don't know why. And I don't know why they trust universities. My feeling is that the majority of Mexicans don't go to the university. That's why they trust universities, because they don't know them. If they knew the universities, I wonder. Now, if they knew the church, well, these days, with Father Maciel and things like that, but these are... now, what is the essential institutions of democracy? These are representatives. They are, after all, sovereignty is in the hands of the diputados, basically, and the senadores. They are at the bottom. And political parties. That's a disgrace. That's political parties. And I don't know why police is not here, because police and political parties are more or less at the bottom. Yeah, the police here. Look at it. What a beauty. The police, the representatives, and the political parties. Mexicans don't trust them. It's impossible. You have to be nuts to go to a policeman and say, I have a problem. Yeah? The moment you say that, you will have two problems. And political parties, my God, you really cry looking at that. And senators, they are a really peculiar bunch. They feel that they are really senators. They talk like senators, they dress like senators, and they spend like senators. But they are unable to really produce what they are supposed to produce. The legal framework of Mexico. Mexico is crumbling. Well, so that's what, let me see what time I have... I said that at 5 o'clock isn't. It's well. I'm not on a schedule, but this is it. What I wanted to say here is nothing that I am happy with. I'm not proud of what is happening in Mexico. It's really a terrible crisis what we are living. We don't know what the future will be for us. Without everything, we don't trust the political elite. And the trust of the army. But day by day, the army is failing in the task they are now having to perform, that is the war against drugs, the narco traffickers. The church, the mediocrity of the church in Mexico, the upper levels of the church, well, they are disgusting. Bankers, the president, and we have the richest family on earth. That's also that has a kind of well, you have to smile. You have the irony of the situation is that we have Slim, and we don't have a president really. We don't know what is going to happen. So in the midst of this crisis, we are not. Somebody is celebrating the Centennial and the Bicentennial. But you don't feel that Mexicans are excited about this, because it's impossible. It will be against the common sense to celebrate. So only the official bureaucracy is celebrating. And they are spending and spending and spending, and they have thousands of events. But I don't see, and that's the last thing that I will say, I don't see how a government that is conservative, that is really a rightist government, can celebrate two events that are revolutionary by nature, that destroy the institutional setting. They send institutions to hell, as López Obrador said, al diablo con sus instituciones. That's exactly what the insurgents said in 1810, and finally the revolutionaries said in 1910. To hell with an institutional framework that was not acceptable to the revolutionary forces. So a conservative government celebrating this, and celebrating this in the midst of a crisis, it's really it's nonsense. But this forces us to think, and this forces the US to think. Because responsibility of this failure is shared. It's not only ours. And the US is looking at, I think that Afghanistan and Iraq or something, but close to it, very close to it. These three killings of the consular corps in Ciudad Juárez is just a reminder that the US has almost a failed state along 3,000 kilometers of its southern border. And nobody wants to accept that, even less Carlos Pascual, the US ambassador in Mexico, that is trying to make sense of all this. And you look at him and you see that he doesn't know exactly what to do with this. Then Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of Defense, Janet Reno, the head of the DEA, all went to Mexico 10 days or 15 days ago. And what was the end product of that peculiar? We have never had such a delegation, a high-level delegation of US government officials in Mexico. Never in our life, in our 200 years of independence. And they didn't say anything. They met with the Mexican counterpart and they said, well, we have to look at the social issues. Oh my God, at the social issues. That's what Hillary Clinton said. It's about time to say that. But now, to do what? What is the answer? The continuation of what is happening now. The army is still there. We are failing. And look at the San Francisco, it's San Francisco Chronicle of today. 20-something deaths yesterday in Mexico related to crime. And one of them, it was reported finally here, it was teenagers, 10 teenagers in Durango that went in a truck to pick up their scholarship. And they were killed in the highway, like in the bandit nation of the 19th century. But in the 19th century, and that's it, the end, Fraser said that bandits were to a certain extent gentlemen of the road because they try not to be very violent with the people they assaulted or robbed. But now, it's really the brutality of the crimes. You cannot believe why they are torturing and killing in such a way. I'm not able to understand my own country quite well, and my profession is to try to understand it. And I'm failing also at doing this. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to take one at a time, or do you want to aggregate the questions?
As you.
Oh, we have time for questions and discussion, please keep your comments brief so we can have as many people involved as possible. Yes?
Talking about upheavals, I know it's difficult to predict because being from Mexico, I wondered this many times. What do you see as the upheaval of the future? Is it going to be an explosion of the drug dealing and narco traffic? Just a total diminishment of authority? Or do you see some sort of future in the small but sure organization of the gobierno legítimo with the cards and empoderamiento of the people? Where do you see this going?
It's a good question. Years ago, 5 years ago, for example, it was very common to say, well, 2010 is coming, and it's a kind of, I don't know, maldición or bendición, but Mexico will have to have a new revolution. It was made as a joke, but with something in it. Now, we are in that year. I don't see any possibility of an upheaval, because something that looks like a revolution, no. I don't see the leadership, the idea of a revolution in the 21st century is very weak now. The Zapatistas tried just for a brief moment at the beginning of the rebellion. They said our aim is to go to the Distrito Federal and to have lunch in Tres Marias and then take the National Palace. Well, revolution is not on the cards, and that's the most unsettling thing, that we don't even know what. Probably there is something that looks like a revolution now, because there are several armies in Mexico, are very well trained and very well equipped, and with lots of money. The narco traffickers, they have 2, 3, 4, 5 armies. There is a national army and the Navy that the daily clash. So there is a war going on, according to Felipe Calderon. He defined it as a war, something that I think was a mistake, a very terrible mistake to define a war in those terms, because either you win the war or you lose the war, and the enemy is stronger every time. You are not winning that war. And a war against, if those are the insurgents, the narco traffickers, just by the fact to be there, they are winning. They don't have to take the National Palace or Los Pinos. Just to remain there against a professional army, and the army cannot overcome the power of the narco traffickers. So, is there a war? In any case, it's not a revolution. There is not an elite of revolutionaries willing to challenge the government. Nothing like that. So what's my feeling is that the government is like cracking, and it's a very unable, their capacity is very limited of the federal government. And the local governments, my God, look at Ulises Ruiz and the local Fidel Herrera and the governor of Puebla. They are unable. But on the other hand, the opposition is also unable, unwilling to provide leadership as the government. So right now, I don't see anybody seizing the opportunity that the crisis will transform itself into something constructive. When Obama took place, his aide, I cannot remember his name, said, "This is a crisis too good to be wasted. We have to," I like the idea. crisis too good to be wasted. Well, we have a very good crisis in Mexico. But my feeling is that it's wasted. That there is nothing positive coming out of this kind of inferno that we have. So a new revolution, a new upheaval, something that can send Mexico through a period of instability, but with the possibility of becoming something else, I don't see. I hope I'm wrong. I hope, I pray that I am wrong. Although I'm not a believer, I pray in that sense that to be wrong. There are periods in history in which mediocrity is just everywhere, and long periods of mediocrity. Look at Argentina. Argentina was really a winning country at the beginning of the 20th century. They were rich, well-educated, they had a wonderful country geography, and they wasted their opportunity. Argentina is still unable to have something meaningful to say about Argentina to themselves and to the rest of the world. So that's an example of a country that cannot really produce anything else but to reproduce mediocrity. And I thought that Mexico could not go that way even 10 years ago. But now, I don't know if that's going to be the future. Nothing, not even a revolution, just another turn of the screw and the same thing again and again and again until I don't know how we are going to solve this problem.
Yes.
Professor, do you think if the PRI wins the next presidential elections, they will bring new stability for Mexico?
Well, stability, I think Mexico is stable. It's not that bring back stability. Stability is still with us, but it's not the kind of stability that we like. Now, what is the PRI? The PRI remains the same party of the past. Look at the leadership. The leaders were socialized during the last part of the authoritarian period. Now, the young one, Peña Nieto, the governor of the state of Mexico, is young biologically, but is so old in intellectual terms, in moral terms. He is the product of the Grupo Atlacomulco that was created by Isidro Fabela, and Estado de Mexico has perhaps one of the most successful priista factions because they don't fight among themselves. They remain loyal to the leader to the very end. They are very disciplined, have money, have experience, but have nothing new to give us. Probably PRI will win. Yes, it's a possibility. But then we will go back. It's like Russia going back to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Somebody can say, well, but they are there. Putin is, to a certain extent, the old communist bureaucrat. But at least they have something different. The name of the party is it's different. In Mexico, it will be the same name. The same. A party has an origin, good or bad, and the seal of the origin is very difficult to erase. And the PRI has a non-democratic, authoritarian seal. So if they come back in the year 2010, they will be better at keeping stability? Probably, yes. They will not declare war against the narco-traffickers. They will declare we have won and that's it. And they will try to negotiate with them. But it will be a return to the past to a certain extent.
Yes.
Tell me what's good about Mexico, man. I mean, you are providing a really catastrophic perspective of Mexico, but the perspective I live in that nobody can be there, and I see you there. I see you are a successful guy. And you are see that you don't have any prospect to come or to live from Mexico. So what's good about Mexico? He said everything in Mexico terrible for every
recall what I am here. I am here to talk about two political events. And I'm talking about politics. Mexico is more than politics. I'm talking about political life in Mexico, and it's a disaster. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. What do you want me to say? Oh, no, don't worry. Then listen, bring Felipe Calderón here. He will be happy to tell you. He said last week, se vale hablar bien de México. Well, when a president has to go that far, it's because he's lacking in arguments. I'm talking about politics. If you want to talk about the cultural life of Mexico, the daily life of Mexicans, the other things can be very positive. But I'm pinpointing the political element. And there is nothing, or you tell me what is, give me something, make me look silly. I will be very glad. Because I want to be positive. I wanted even in the year 2000, when Cuauhtemoc lost, I voted for Cuauhtemoc. And I said, well, my God, but it's this guy. Well, something I wanted to believe, as many Mexicans wanted to believe. But no.
Yes.
Hi, I agree that there is no independence in the revolutions of sunset. And I agree with all the chart that you have there. I only disagree with the great colony. You mentioned that there were only a few revolts in there in 300 years. But if we start with the Namate and the Colmestre revolt from right after 1521 in Bajío, for those 300 years, you can really find information about 1,000 revolts.
Yes, yes, Leticia Reina has a very good book on local revolts, and there were always rebellions, but not in the sense of Tupac Amaru in Peru, in which they wanted to overthrow the whole government. They were against the bad representatives of His Catholic Majesty that were not fulfilling the wishes of His Majesty, but the king was good. The high authority, that authority that was never seen in Mexico, was just imagined by Mexicans, that authority was never challenged, was challenged many hundreds, thousands perhaps, of local authorities. But it was the spirit of revolt in Mexico that was present in those 300 years was produced by local grievances. Once those grievances were more or less accepted and the authority more or less changed things, the revolt subsided. But the spirit of the Peruvians that was really defied the whole authority. It was only in 1810. It's the first time that since Martín Cortés, because Martín Cortés and the small group of criollos began this process of confrontation with the authority, but they were overpowered very easily.
Could you mention
Public.
We're not going to have, we don't have time for follow-up. We have time actually for two more questions. Yes.
Okay, I have a question on the role of immigration in why there isn't effective change in Mexico. And I actually grew up in Peru in the 80s, and when I look at the Peruvian people, they're very calm and modest and reserved people, but it was a very brutal, bloody uprising. I mean, my dad's office got bombed. I mean, there were bombs going off every night. And, that's generally a very modest, calm people. And, when I think of Mexico, I mean, growing up in LA, I saw like just masses of people coming, young men and women coming from Mexico during the 80s when we had the financial crisis. And so I guess my question would be, one, do you think that the loss of millions of Mexicans who are desperate, who are young and willing to take risks, to lose them across the border might be depleting a population group that would have started a social revolution? And two, do you think the loss of a lot of young men from a lot of the towns in Mexico has disrupted the family structure to the point where a lot of youth don't have maybe the traditions you were speaking of, like the bandits, to maybe police together, and start some kind of social movement?
It's a sensible proposition, but if you lack leadership, even if you can gather 1 million young people in Mexico full of disappointments and frustrations and eager to do something because what they see as their future is very mediocre. But if they don't have the organization, I think that you will see millions of individuals frustrated and trying to look for their own individual salvation, going to the United States or going to the narco traffic, because that's the most tragic element of the war against narco traffickers in Mexico. You can kill thousands. More will come because the Ejército de Reserva, the reserve army for the narco traffickers, is just unlimited and is full of young people. Young people are at the core of this. People in their 20s that are more than willing to risk their lives. But the only available path is right now narco traffic. There is nothing in the political leadership that will inflame their imagination and make their efforts to put together with some constructive idea. I think that this is a failure of elites. It's not a failure of the vast majority of Mexicans. They are willing to take risks, as you said. Coming to the U.S., it's a risk. They are very entrepreneurial. And if the narco traffickers offer them just 3 years of good life, 4 years of good life, you will be dead. But my God, those 4 years I will live at the fullest. I will not be humiliated. I will have money. I will have sense of power. For what? For the same thing that the bandits in the 19th century did those things. They were, according to the statistic of Fraser, it's interesting. They were basically people between 20 and 30 years old. Basically married people with families and willing to go to the highway and take risks. I think that the same is happening now. But you can, that's the failure of the elites, because you could use that power, that commitment, that willingness to tackle obstacles to something positive. But if there is nothing they can do individually, so they come to the US or they join the ranks.
Maybe you can start a revolution.
We're not going to do that. Before I take the last question, I would like to I would like to make an announcement about an upcoming Center for Latin American Studies event in this series. On April 15th, Jose Nato, the rector of UNAM, will be speaking on a topic that we will soon have published on our website. So if you check that or are on our email list, April 15th, Jose Nato, the rector of UNAM. So we'll take one final question. Yes?
Yes, I would like to know what is your opinion of how the actual crisis of the United States, internally and international, is affecting and it's going to affect Mexico because the United States is becoming more unequal and more dangerous. And also, in your very interesting overview of the history, contemporary history of Mexico, I feel that there are so many reasons why this happened. We don't have complete autonomy, independence, complete democracy as faith. And in spite of many intents, the Mexican Revolution was very serious intent to democratize Mexico politically and economically and socially, with Cárdenas and also before with Obregón. And what are the reasons? It's the failure of the left, our neighborhood with the United States, and in this sense, what can be done?
It's a good question. When Ingeniero Cárdenas was the presidential opposition candidate in 1988, probably he won, but there was still the Cold War in the last years of the Cold War, the last year almost, and the sense that the left cannot be allowed to win was very much alive in the U.S. The U.S. ambassador there in Guadalajara, Mr. Pilliot, said that the election of 1988 was a perfect election. When everybody knew that fraud was there to see for everybody, the support of the U.S. to the status quo was at the same time natural and important. The U.S. wants Mexico to be stable. If democratic, wonderful. If not, stable. Stability is the main objective of the U.S. So what happens in the U.S., yes, it's important. For example, when Obama won, I said, well, this is going to have a spillover effect, and Mexico is going to be affected. But I am still wondering how, when, and how, because it seems in the short run that it's two unrelated events. What is happening in Mexico and what is happening in the U.S. I thought that it was going to be a more open-mindedness on the part of the U.S. government, looking at Mexico more critical, looking not so much for immediate stability, but for the long-run process. That the objective, as during the Woodrow Wilson time, when he was willing to look at the Mexican Revolution and to a certain extent allowed it to happen because it was one way of modernizing the system, not supporting the military dictatorship of Victoriano Huerta, but allow the revolution within limits to transform the system. So I thought, well, perhaps with Obama, something similar could happen. But nothing is happening, at least not right now. Probably in the long run, but I don't know if the U.S. is going to remain in this direction, or the Republicans are, the Republicans are coming, they are coming, and they will reshape the whole political spectrum of the US. But yes, the US has a definite influence in Mexico, but not automatic. Because if Mexico is not an independent country, it's not a colony. It has a power of its own and reasons of its own. The US can influence, but cannot remake Mexico. The influences have been positive and negative. As I said, in the 1988 election, the US was just supportive of the PRI, of the fraud, of everything that was against the changing of the system. Then came the year 2000 and said, well, it's okay. Let us allow the change. There is no Cold War now, and PRI looks very corrupt, and Fox looks, well, they thought, looks better. But we have to know what is the thinking of the U.S. That, well, the U.S. is preoccupied with the U.S. basically. Then probably with Afghanistan and Iraq right now, with China, and with little else. Europe is already out of the radar, and Latin America doesn't exist. But because we have share the border, probably we will exist. And that border is becoming more and more problematic. So the US has to do something. But I think that they don't know what to do. Otherwise, you cannot understand such a huge delegation in Mexico, and it's like a Parto de los Montes. Such a big mass of power there, and the result was a little mouse that was irrelevant.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Meyer for being with us.